This is the Reflection Podcast. I'm Ed Blonsky. Thanks for joining me today. On today's show, I'm going to be having a conversation about C.S. Lewis, one of the most influential theologians, apologists, authors, and just interesting Christian of the 20th century. He is the author of the very famous series of books, The Chronicles of Narnia. But he is more than that. And I'm going to be talking with a man who has taken a deep dive into the life and the theology of C.S. Lewis, Dr. Joel Heck, who I met 40 years ago, and I'm proud to call him my friend. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation. I hope that you will enjoy this look at C.S. Lewis on this episode of the Reflection Podcast. In the pastor's office with me today is Joel Heck. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I am too, because recently one of my lay members at my church where I serve is going to be teaching. He asked me, can I teach a Bible class on C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity? And I thought, you know what? I know exactly the guy who I need to talk to get him going on that. And that's probably the most in-depth scholar I know on C.S. Lewis. But of course, to be honest, I don't know that many of them anyway. So, but I have known Joel for about 40 years now. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Joel, can you give us a little bit of background before we head into the C.S. Lewis conversation about yourself and what you're doing these days?
Certainly. Yeah, I'm a pastor's kid, and I grew up in a pastor's home and had always had my sights set on pastoral ministry and headed that direction. Shot out of a bow and arrow directly at pastoral ministry, and I served 9 years as a pastor while I was doing part-time graduate work at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, finished a doctorate, and ended up getting a call to Concordia University, Wisconsin, my alma mater, where I taught for 14 years. And then after that, I was employed at Concordia University, Texas, first as academic dean and then as professor of theology. And so I've taught there for many years. And towards the end of that career, I saw this opportunity in Edmonton, Alberta, where they were looking for an interim president for a 2-year span of time in between the previous president and the man who'll be the next president. And I thought, yeah, that's something I could do because I was a visiting professor here 7 years ago. So I knew the place, and knew some of the people. And so I applied and ended up running the gauntlet of interviews and questions and answers and the like, and ended up getting the call to serve here. So came out of a 1-year retirement to serve as the interim president, a 2-year appointment. And so I'm preparing for the next person. We're in the call process and hoping within the next few weeks to have somebody called and having accepted the call to serve as the next president on a more or less permanent basis.
When did you know you wanted to be a pastor, and how did that come about? I asked that question a lot of my pastor friends, especially on the podcast, because I think it's important for people to maybe identify how God does call us.
I was 10 years old when I and my siblings were heading towards a playground in a small town in central Iowa. And we got to talking, us kids, especially the older ones, I was one of 5, about what we wanted to do when we grew up. And I said I wanted to be a doctor. And my sister asked why. And I said, well, because I want to help people. And she said, well, if you want to help people, why don't you be a pastor? And it clicked just like that. And from that moment on, I have known that I wanted to be a pastor. And I've been serving in a pastoral position ever since. I mean, ever since graduating from seminary way back when.
It's amazing how God works, isn't it? That in your sister, that was the conduit through which God gave you that call to be a servant in the church, and you've served so well and in so many different ways. We first met and when you were a professor at Concordia in Wisconsin, and at the time you were teaching languages and theology and evangelism, as I recall. And that kind of leads me into why we're having this conversation today of being able to tell people about Jesus. When did you get involved in really starting to dig deep into the writings and the work of C.S. Lewis?
It was 1995. I remember well. I was a teacher at Concordia University, Wisconsin, and there was an opportunity to teach in London, England. And I was kind of the next person up in this consortium of Concordias that were sending students to Oak Hill College each fall. And so there were 12 students that went with me. I wrote a prospectus for a course on Lewis because I was kind of interested in him, but I didn't know all that much about him. So I put a lot of work into a prospectus, masqueraded as a C.S. Lewis scholar, and they liked the prospectus and they accepted it. And I got appointed to teach Lewis as well as history of England in 1995 in a northern suburb of London. And that really catapulted my career and my interest in Lewis. And I've been doing a lot of Lewis ever since.
When did you first pick up one of his books?
I don't know the exact time, but I remember being in seminary and probably having read all of the Chronicles of Narnia and maybe heard a little bit about Mere Christianity. So the exact date when I did that, probably during my college years, I read for the first time The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe and was captivated by that children's story and noted it was a whole lot more than a children's story. So I read a little bit more. And by the time I was at Concordia, Wisconsin, and applied for that teaching position in London for just one semester, I had read about 10 books. I mean, the 7 Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity and a couple of others, of the main ones that he's known for, like the Screwtape Letters, and have been doing a lot of Lewis from that time on, since 1995 especially.
I was at Concordia when I first picked up a C.S. Lewis book, but it was Out of the Silent Planet. I don't know what attracted me. I'm a big science fiction fan. If you look over my bookshelf over here, half the bookshelf is science fiction books, and then the other half is theology books. And but it was something. I guess somebody must have told me, "Oh, you like science fiction? Why don't you read this book?" And I read that trilogy, and then I got into the Chronicles of Narnia, and so that kind of leads the question. The why C.S. Lewis wrote as he did, the concepts, dare say the theology that we have in all of his stories as well as his nonfiction books. Where does that come from in Lewis?
Just God's gift to Lewis. I have a story from one of his former students, a guy by the name of Derek Brewer, who tells this story. He says, once in the middle of my essay, his phone rang. So he's in a tutorial session with Lewis. He says, I stopped and he answered it in the other room. When he returned after a 5-minute interruption, he repeated verbatim my last sentence as far as it had got. He had an astonishing verbatim memory and could repeat whole passages of prose to illustrate a point arising in discussion. Given any line of Paradise Lost, he could continue with the following lines from memory. So he was just a brilliant man with a tremendous memory, former atheist, by the way. So his delving into all kinds of occultish interests, as well as some atheistic writings, helped to prepare him to become the person that he was. So in addition to the gifts that God gave him, he was known as the best read man in England of his day. He read voraciously, hundreds of books. I mean, he read a book. I once did a study of his reading list that shows up in his diary. And he read one book about every 3 days. And not necessarily short books like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He had a gift for combining the two sides of the brain. You know, they talk about us being very logical and rational on one side and then imaginative and creative on the other. And he seems to have had a gift for bringing both together. And there aren't very many people that are both left-brained and right-brained. We're usually one or the other and not both. And he seems to have been both. Just an amazing intellect, plus of course, his conversion to Christianity gave him material to write about and a mission in life. He once said that most of my books are evangelistic, and that was his reason for writing, is to convey the truth of God, sometimes in literary form and sometimes in more specifically Christian writing.
Maybe would we dive into this story with the chronologically Lewis, but how did where was the conversion in Lewis, as starting out pretty much as an atheist and then converting to Christianity? Where and how does that happen?
Yeah, he grew up in a nominally Christian home in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His parents were members of the Church of Ireland, which is part of the Church of England. He adopted atheism at age 14 and then stayed an atheist until he was about 30. Let's see, it was in 1931 that he became a theist. So he's 33 years old. And so I'm losing my train of thought. Ask me your question again.
So, who was instrumental in converting him to Christianity, other than obviously the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, a bunch of writers. So he read G.K. Chesterton, who had a profound impact on him. He read George Herbert, the 14th or 15th century poet. He read all kinds of other authors, all of whom seemed to be Christian. And then he read some other writers who were atheists that he should have identified with, and he thought they were all thin. So he says in his autobiography that a sound atheist can't be too careful because there are traps laid for him everywhere. So there were a few friends of his by the name of Owen Barfield was one of them. And he became a theist, though not a Christian. Lewis became a Christian a little bit later on, but there are some significant influences in his life. Though he grew up in a nominally Christian home, he became an atheist I said, at age 14. And then probably the book that started him back on the road to Christianity was a book by George MacDonald, a Scottish Presbyterian writer who was not alive at the time that Lewis wrote, but it's a book called Fantastes, and he says it's a book that baptized his imagination, and it started him on the road back to Christianity in a journey that took 15 years, but he admitted that God was God and became a theist, and then a little more than a year later became a Christian. And J.R. Tolkien and another friend by the name of Hugo Dyson were two men that were very influential in Lewis's conversion to Christianity at that time after he had become a theist.
I think we'll have to save that conversation maybe for another episode of the podcast on the Inklings, is who you're talking about there, that group of writers that would share their writings, where C.S. Lewis was sharing some of the Chronicles of Narnia as he was writing them, and Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But this concept you came up, we're going to talk about your website. We're going to give links to that on C.S. Lewis, chronologically Lewis. Explain that to me?
Well, that's a 1,300-page database that consists of events in the life of C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren over the course of their entire lifetime. It's 750,000 words long, and it has over 5,000 footnotes, if you want to be impressed a little bit. But it lists day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, what Lewis and his brother were doing at any given time for which we have information. So they both wrote a lot of letters. Lewis kept a diary for about 6 years. Warren kept a diary for his entire life. And then we have lots of other historical documents, including the letters of J.R. Tolkien that mention Lewis many times, as well as other books that recount stories about Lewis. And so I've got over 200 biographical sources, basically a bibliography at the end of this database. So if you want to know what Lewis was doing on any given point between 1898 and 1963, you can open up this database and search for that date, and you'll be able to find, if we have information on that date, you'll be able to find what Lewis or his brother was doing on that day in history.
Quite an invaluable resource. I am Sure, because I know I'm very interested in, what was happening in the world, in their world that made them the person they are. And of course, C.S. Lewis lived through an incredible time in history, through both world wars, and then into the 1960s as well, and all the upheaval out of the Second World War. Um, Tell me a little bit about, we'll get into this maybe at the end, where you can suggest some books to us, but what have you written about C.S. Lewis and maybe why you went in those directions?
Yeah, I've written 6 books, basically. One of them co-authored by my daughter and myself. It's the last one that we wrote, which is a takeoff on the Chronicles of Narnia. It's called The Lion That Roared. But prior to that, I wrote a book, C.S. Lewis on Education. I reprinted 2 books that Lewis had a hand in. One called The Personal Heresy, which is a collection of 3 essays by Lewis and 3 essays by an English professor from Cambridge University on whether a book or a piece of writing by a particular author is a reflection of the author's personality, or if it's more about the subject matter that the author addresses. Lewis says the latter. Tilliard was his name, says the former. I reprinted the Socratic Digest, which is a collection of notes and papers presented at the Socratic Club in Oxford that Lewis was the president of for about 12 years. I wrote a couple of books for Concordia Publishing House. Well, the main one for CPH was From Atheism to Christianity. So it's a careful study of the various steps that Lewis took over those 15 years between 1916 and 1931 when he became a Christian. So that was published in 2017. The most recent book, I mean, apart from that children's story that my daughter and I authored, is a book called No Ordinary People and subtitled 21 Friendships of C.S. Lewis. So that's published by Winged Lion Press out of New York. But beyond that, I've also written 44 articles, 2 of which are waiting to be published. A lot of them are now chapters in the book No Ordinary People, but I've done a lot of work on the life of C.S. Lewis, the history of Lewis, what he did at any given time, things that he wrote, but friendships that he had, and including his friendship with his best friend throughout his entire lifetime was his brother Warren. So they were very, very close. They lived together for most of their lives, and on up until the death of C.S. Lewis in 1963, they were living together in Oxford, in Headington Quarry, Oxford, a place called the Kilns.
You mentioned that some of the famous people that C.S. Lewis knew and was friends with, probably the most famous for a lot of people is Tolkien. And of course, Tolkien gets a lot of press these days with all the movies and the TV series and the different writings that are coming out with him. But what about you? You mentioned a few of the not so famous people that he knew. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, I decided to look at some of the people that weren't nearly as well known as Tolkien and Charles Williams and Dorothy Sayers, people like that, people who are among the 7 authors whose works are collected at the Wade Center in Wheaton College. So I have written this book about these 21 different friendships, his family doctor, Robert E. Havard, some of his college classmates like A.K. Hamilton Jenkin, which is a name that almost no one knows anything about. Arthur Greaves, who was a lifelong friend from Belfast, Northern Ireland, that he wrote more letters to than any other person. Probably the most famous of the people I wrote about, besides Warren Lewis, is a science fiction writer that I bet you know this name, Arthur C. Clarke.
Yep,
Does
I've
that
heard of
name
him.
ring a bell with you?
Oh yeah.
Yes. So Clarke was actually a young writer, still early in his writing career, when Lewis published his Ransom trilogy, and the second one, Perelandra, was published, and Clarke read it because he liked science fiction, he liked space travel, and he became the president of the British Interplanetary Society for several years. And he read that book and he was incensed that Lewis would paint a scientist as the villain in that story. And he wrote to Lewis, and they ended up dialoguing back and forth over a few letters. And Lewis, in the process, helped Clarke to become a better writer. And I think Clarke became as successful as he was, partly because he was indebted to Lewis. So there is an orbit above the Earth at the equator that is named the Clarke orbit because of the significance that Arthur Clarke has had in space exploration. He was the very first person to propose the idea of a series of telecommunication satellites floating above the Earth and making telecommunication possible. So that was probably 20 years before it came to fruition. So they named this orbit after him. So he wrote over 100 books. He ended up becoming something of a friend of Lewis, was an atheist throughout his lifetime, or most of his lifetime, and never did become a Christian in spite of Lewis's influence. But there's several others who are also atheists. I mean, here's this former atheist who's not exactly gravitating to atheists, but he ended up having a few of them as his friends. One of them was an undergraduate student of his by the name of Alan Richard Griffiths, who was studying English with Lewis, and Lewis calls him his chief companion on the road to Christianity. So both of them became Christian. Lewis went back to the Church of England, and Griffiths became a Roman Catholic. Harry Weldon, who might have been more of an agnostic than an atheist, but who made a famous statement in the 1920s that Lewis was shocked by when Weldon said that the evidence for the resurrection was surprisingly strong. And when Lewis heard that from a guy he thought of as an atheist, he went back to the Gospels himself and checked out the evidence and found out that Weldon was being honest and pretty accurate in what he said. Another student of his by the name of Mary Nayland, or her maiden name was Mary Shelley, and she's actually distantly related to the woman who wrote Frankenstein, but it's not the same person. But Mary Shelley was his student in English literature and later on became a Christian, partly because of the influence of C.S. Lewis. And then there's a J.B.S. Haldane, who was a biologist and an atheist who, like Clarke, never did become a Christian, but ended up debating Lewis at the Oxford Socratic Club, which was that Socratic Digest that I mentioned earlier, that we reprinted those essays and notes that secretaries took of various presentations. Haldane debated Lewis at the Socratic Club. But there were a lot of others. There were some colleagues, both men and women. The person he worked with as he was president of the Socratic Club, Stella Aldwinkle, who was on the pastoral staff of Somerville College in Oxford. Nan Dunbar, who was a young classics scholar at Cambridge University. Muriel Bradbrook, who was a Cambridge University Shakespeare scholar, and a whole bunch of others, including several family members, by the way. Janie Moore, who became Lewis's adopted mother and lived with her for several decades from about 1919 until her death in 1951. Maureen Moore, Janie Moore's daughter, and so those two were family members as well as Warren Lewis. So 21 different names. I won't go through all of them, but that's a few of the highlights.
He is quite an influence, and I would think people would certainly understand, yes, through his writings, but it was the personal relationships that he had with a whole gamut of people. I think I can understand how he would bring atheists into his orbit. I mean, he understood the language, he spoke the language, being one himself, and I could see that he could very well see, this is the reason I'm a Christian, is to be able to at least present the gospel and let the Holy Spirit do his thing. with these people, and certainly did that. I mean, uh, C.S. Lewis is a scholar, a teacher, a professor, a writer. Uh, One of the words that keeps coming to mind, though, is an apologist. He was
Yes.
known as a Christian apologist, and didn't he had a series of radio broadcasts, I believe, during World War II on the
Yes.
BBC. That was very much that's what it was. It was Christian apology. Could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes, those were broadcast talks over the BBC that are the origin of the book Mere Christianity. And when he writes the preface to Mere Christianity, he says he's just kind of an ordinary Church of England layman, but he was recruited for these BBC talks partly because he had once been an unbeliever, and the BBC people thought that he might understand where some people were coming from. Of course, he's very, very modest, very humble in the way that he approaches this, and was in reality a very brilliant writer who was able to write powerfully. I mean, he's an English professor, and the best writers that I've ever known have been people whose life's work was how to write a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter, a book, or an essay, and really know how to make the English language do its work. But he was doing Christian apologetics in Mere Christianity. And he didn't initially think of it as being a book because he was just asked to do a series of 4 talks by Eric Fenn, who was the assistant to the director of religious broadcasting, who had read Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, and really liked what Lewis had to say there, thought his style was compelling. And so Fenn, who was a Presbyterian layman, invited him to speak on the BBC. And so he gave those 4 talks, and he was so effective that they asked him to do another series, and he did a second series, then a third, and then a fourth in the 1940s, all during World War II. And then a few years later, he ended up deciding to turn it into a book, combined all those chapters, wrote a few more chapters, and now we have Mere Christianity, which is divided into those 4 books that have the same titles that the broadcast talks originally had when he gave them in 1941, 42, and 1944.
You mentioned that he lived with his adopted mother and his brother for most of his life. Did he ever
Yes,
marry?
he did marry. In fact, some of your listeners will have heard of the movie Shadowlands, which is a movie adaptation of a book by Brian Sibley called Shadowlands. That book was turned into a stage play, a movie made for television, and then a movie made for cinema. So there are 3 different versions of Shadowlands, and it tells the story of meeting Joy Davidman, who was a Jewish convert to Christianity, former atheist herself, by the way, who read Lewis and found his writings very powerful and effective, and started a pen pal relationship with Lewis in 1950, ended up wanting to visit him. And so she came across from New York State to England and ended up meeting him. And they really hit it off because her mind was brilliant. And perhaps for one of the first times in his life, he met someone who had an intellect that was the equivalent of his. And so their relationship developed. Eventually, Joy Davidman contracted cancer, and it looked like she was going to die. So he understood that he loved her and didn't want to marry her, or didn't want to lose her. And so he ended up proposing marriage a second time. Actually, there's a funny thing about this relationship is they got married twice. First time in 1956, when Joy, who liked England and wanted to stay there with her 2 boys, she was estranged from her husband that eventually divorced her. She wanted to stay in England, and so Lewis agreed to extend his British citizenship to her by uh, marrying her in a lawyer's office with no intent whatsoever that they lived together. And then less than a year later, he married her before the church. And in between those 2 marriages, she fell, broke her leg because the cancer had eaten through most of the bone, and he realized he was about to lose her, didn't want to lose her, and he proposes. He thinks she's on her deathbed and that she'll never leave the hospital, but miraculously, the cancer goes into remission. She recovers. She's able to leave the hospital, and they have 3 pretty normal years of married life in the late 1950s until cancer returns and takes her life in July of 1960. So the movie or the stage play or the book Shadowlands is a story, especially of the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman.
So, who's Mrs. Moore then? Tell me about that.
Mrs. Moore, Janie Moore. So when Lewis matriculated to Oxford University, he was a student at University College, one of the 30-some colleges of the university. And he signed up, this is World War I is going on. He signed up for the Officers Training Corps because even though he was an Irish citizen and was therefore exempt from service in the British Army, he thought it was his duty to enlist, and he did, and he became an officer in the British Army. And he ended up having a room, a billet, the British call it, when they were in their training program with Paddy Moore, who was the son of Janie Moore. And so the two of them really hit it off. They became really, really great friends. They were both training to be officers in the British Army. And they made an agreement that if they both got deployed to the war and one of them returned and the other one didn't, the survivor would take care of the other person's parent. So by this time, Lewis's mother had died of cancer in 1908. So he meets Paddy Moore in 1917 when he's a student at Oxford University and just has matriculated to Oxford. And then they both get shipped off to the war later on that year. In fact, he celebrates his 19th birthday on the Western Front in France. And as things turn out, Paddy Moore dies in a big German offensive early on after they've gotten to France to fight in the war. And, you know, the war ended in 1918. They get there in 1917. So it's the latter stages of the war. Paddy dies in that offensive. Jack survives, partly because he got trench fever and was shipped back to a hospital in order to recover in part of the time in France, part of the time in London. And then when he came back to the war, he ended up being wounded when a piece of friendly fire from the British artillery landed near him, took the life of a sergeant who was in his platoon, which actually saved his life, but he carried a piece of shrapnel in his rib cage for about 20 years before doctors were able to remove it in surgery in the early 1940s. So Paddy did not survive. He did, and he kept his part of the bargain, and he arranged to take care of Mrs. Moore as well as Mrs. Moore's daughter. Being a good friend of Paddy, he wanted to do what he could for his friend, even after his friend's death. And so he ended up living with Janie Moore for about 40 years and Maureen Moore until she grew up and got an education, went into teaching field of music, got married, and et cetera, but took care of Janie Moore until her death in 1951. So not quite 40 years, 34 years roughly. And her story is one of the chapters in the book. That relationship has been kind of questioned by a lot of people. Some have said there was something very intimate going on there, and some were saying, oh no, Lewis was too committed a Christian. But when he writes about his early years at Oxford University, he says, I was living there without any morals whatsoever. I had not a moral bone in my body, not his exact words. But yeah, I'm almost 100% certain that there was a sexual intimacy there until the time that Lewis became a Christian, when he put a stop to that aspect of their relationship, but he felt obligated to care for her. after his conversion to Christianity, and she became bitter about that. She protected Lewis, she cared for him, she cooked for him, but she claimed atheism as her creed, which is sort of odd that this former atheist had such an impact on the lives of so many people. I mean, there are probably thousands of people who could trace their conversion 100% to the work of the Holy Spirit, but instrumentally through human means to the writings of C.S. Lewis. So he influenced lots and lots of people. But Janie Moore at least kept up the front of this atheistic perspective to the end of her life.
So, a couple of other people that you can maybe tell us about in his life. Walter Hooper.
Yes, Walter Hooper was private secretary to C.S. Lewis for about a month during the last year of Lewis's life. So this is 1963. That summer, Lewis went into a coma, had a heart attack, went into a coma, but woke up from it and recovered for a few more months, lived for a few more months. And during that time, because Lewis realized that he isn't going to be able to continue his teaching career at Cambridge University, he spent 29 years as a professor at Oxford University, the last 9 years at Cambridge University, even while he continued to live in Oxford, would take a train over to Cambridge on Monday and come back on Saturday. And he needed somebody to help with correspondence and some other things. And so he hired Walter Hooper to help him. Hooper was a young professor at the University of Kentucky, part-time professor in English, but he loved the writings of Lewis, and so he was there, he was available, he was willing to help, and so he took care of some of Lewis's correspondence. He wrote letters at Lewis's dictation. When Lewis resigned his position at Cambridge University, Walter went over to Cambridge to bring his books back. But over the course of the next several decades, because Lewis died on November 22nd, 1963, the same day that JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, Hooper dedicated his life to getting the works of Lewis published or republished. So he searched through journals and periodicals of all sorts for every essay of Lewis that had been published, every poem that had been published, and he pulled together several collections of poetry, several collections of essays, and convinced publishers to print those. And of course, Lewis's works sell well even to this day. One of the very few authors whose books are selling more today than they were in his lifetime. I have 19 books on the shelves of my library back in Austin, Texas. I have very few books here because I'm in this 2-year interim. It's probably an embarrassment to me that the shelves behind me have almost nothing on them because, well, we have this impressive theological library here at the seminary. So I've got a tremendous collection of books in our library. So I didn't need to bring many along with me. But back in Austin, Texas, I have 19 books that have Walter Hooper's name, some of them as author, but most of them as editor that pulled together all these poems and essays of Lewis. So Walter was the single most significant reason, apart from Lewis himself and the power of his writings, the single most important human reason why Lewis is being read widely to this day. Just very, very influential. And until his death, probably the #1 Lewis scholar in the world. Had
You
the
owe a debt
chance
of
to meet
gratitude
him.
to him.
Yes, we do.
Yep.
I had
So,
a chance to meet Walter a couple of times in Oxford when I was there doing research for one of my books.
speaking of books about Lewis, so your favorite C.S. Lewis book?
Usually it's the book I'm reading at the time, which just happens to be Mere Christianity. I mean, a very, very powerful book, most influential book. In fact, it is by an objective measurement the most influential of all of C.S. Lewis's books because a guy by the name of Larson once asked a lot of Christian scholars across the United States who are their influential writers for their Christian ministry. and what were the influential books that those writers provided. And so they mention all kinds of people, ancient and modern, but the number one author is C.S. Lewis. And the number one book that they cite is Mere Christianity. So right now, that's what I'm reading. So it's my favorite right now. But if I were to pick an essay of Lewis, it would be The Weight of Glory, a very, very excellent essay about the concept of desire, which is the single most important concept in all of the writings of Lewis. In fact, I've got a quotation that I queued up on my computer that is part of the heart of Lewis's argument for the importance of desire, because it's actually an argument for the existence of God. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That, by the way, is a quotation from Mere Christianity and a chapter on hope. But this concept of desire, nothing in this world can satisfy the desire, then it probably is an indication, Lewis argues, that I was made for another world. So he makes that argument in a lot of different places, and the single most important place where he makes that argument is in this essay, The Weight of Glory, which is actually a sermon that he delivered in 1941 at the University Church in Oxford, England, to a packed crowd during the early years of World War I, when the future of Western civilization hung in the balance. And it is read to this day and admired and just quoted extensively. There's so many powerful statements that he makes in that essay that it, even though it's difficult reading and it's a lot of dense theology and argument packed into this sermon, it repays itself for some of the real nuggets that people pick up out of that essay. Well, I commend it to you and your readers.
Definitely. Obviously, you're a big fan of C.S. Lewis, dedicating so much of your time and your work to him, but certainly you don't agree with everything he had to say.
No, I really don't. I mean, I sometimes tell my students that I love the works of C.S. Lewis. I put him in a sense on a pedestal, but I do not worship him. And as proof of that, I do not own a C.S. Lewis cap, a C.S. Lewis sweatshirt, or a C.S. Lewis drinking cup. Although one time I said that one time too many. And so my students in a C.S. Lewis class that I taught at Austin, Texas, had a specially designed coffee mug made for me that said on the outside of it, "This is Dr. Heck's C.S. Lewis mug." So I had to change my tune after that. But yeah, I don't worship him, but I do appreciate what he has to offer, because he, like I said earlier, he said most of my works are evangelistic. He says there's no greater purpose for an individual Christian than to draw other people to Christ through their witness and through their influence. And so I appreciate Lewis primarily because he's such an effective literary evangelist. People who read Lewis are drawn to the Word of God, to the person of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the one that Lewis lifts up so often in his writings. But as a layman, I mean, he doesn't try to evangelize people in the way that maybe a modern day evangelist would, or even as a pastor would, as he's proclaiming the Word of God from the pulpit or teaching in the Bible class.
Kind of wrapping things up here. We've been going for a little bit here. I think I know the answer. If someone who's never picked up a C.S. Lewis book, what would you recommend their first book to be?
I'd first ask them if they're right-brained or left-brained. So if they're one of these creative, imaginative people, I'd really encourage them to pick up The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And they'll want to read the entire series. Hopefully read them in the order that Lewis wrote them, with the first book that he wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a children's story that's better understood by adults than by children. And it's a significantly serious enough series that a group of several dozen philosophers put together a book called The Chronicles of Narnia on Philosophy, and everyone is a professional philosopher that takes an idea that Lewis articulates in one or more of those Chronicles of Narnia and describes it from a philosopher's perspective in the kind of language that you and I can understand. So if they're this imaginative, creative person, I'd suggest The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If they are more the logical, rational person, there's no better choice than the single most influential book of Lewis, the one mentioned earlier, Mere Christianity.
Anything non C.S. Lewis that you could recommend, other than your own writings, of course, I'm sure, which I will put in the show notes for links to that. But any others that have written or done some work about C.S. Lewis that could maybe be of benefit to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. One of my top 10 books of all time is a book called A Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. He knew Lewis. He became a Christian under the influence of Lewis. He lost his wife tragically to a very rare liver disease, but both of them became Christians under Lewis's influence. Sheldon experienced the tragedy that Lewis did and was comforted very much by Lewis, who called the loss of his wife a severe mercy. And Van Auken was an English professor. As I mentioned earlier, some of the best writers were English professors. So very, very powerful book of Severe Mercy. Another one I'd recommend is called Life on the Silent Planet, which is so new. I mean, if you like science fiction, you'll be interested in this, I think, Ed. But hasn't been released yet. But it's a collection of essays by a rather impressive list of authors, including Michael Ward, Louis Marcus, Susanna Black Roberts, and Joe Rigney, Holly Ordway, very powerful writer, edited by Rhys Laverty. But it's a collection of about a dozen articles, about a third of them on Out of the Silent Planet, the first book in the Ransom trilogy, about a third on Paralandra, the second book, and then a third on That Hideous Strength. And what I especially like about that book is that it helps to spell out Lewis's understanding of gender and sexuality, which our world needs to understand, because the secular world is totally confused about what is a man and what is a woman. Some don't even think they can define what a woman is to this day. And I think Lewis helps to straighten us out, and these dozen or so authors use Lewis's writings in order to help people get that part of their thinking straight. So I highly recommend that. Plus, I'd like to commend Michael Ward's study of the abolition of man, which is also one of Lewis's most influential books. It's a book I have with me called After Humanity. It's sort of like a commentary on the abolition of man. The abolition of man is a defense of objective values and objective standards of right and wrong, but it's a difficult book. It's very dense, very philosophical. And what Michael Ward has done is to help us to understand the abolition of man. So After Humanity is subtitled A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I think, though this isn't the easiest of books either, I think it repays the reader by helping them to understand what Lewis says and why. And it's one of the reasons why I combined recently with a classical education teacher and a professional philosopher from the University of Texas. The three of us wrote an article on how to teach the abolition of man in order to bring that very difficult book to the level of the average reader, help them understand the importance of Lewis's arguments in that book.
Dr. Heck, Joel, I really appreciate you taking some time out in your busy schedule to talk a little C.S. Lewis with me. I hope that maybe down the road we can get together and talk maybe more specific books and articles about him in the near future, my friend.
I would love to do that.
Thank you so much. It was great episode. And again, in the show notes, we'll have more and links to all of this and to Dr. Heck's website. Thanks so much, Joel.
You're welcome.
To find out more about Dr. Heck and C.S. Lewis, there are links in the show notes to Dr. Heck's website, and you can find out more about the author and the theologian C.S. Lewis. And knowing that he's just more than a children's book writer of the Chronicles of Narnia, so much more, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. So follow the links and let me know what you think of Dr. Heck and C.S. Lewis. I'd love to hear your comment. Rate the show as well while you're doing that, and then share it across your socials. We'd love to have more people get in touch with the Reflection Podcast, which is produced by St. Matthew Lutheran Church in Hawthorne Woods, Illinois. We are in the northeast corner of Illinois, about an hour outside of Chicago, only a little less than an hour from O'Hare Airport. We'd love to have you join us as our guest. You can go to our website to plan your visit. We are at www.stmatts.net. That's stmatts.net. All of our Bible studies and worship services and many of our other events are streamed live, for the most part, on our website. You can find us there. We're also on Facebook and Instagram and on YouTube. This has been the Reflection Podcast. Thanks for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you again next time. God's richest blessings to you.